Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Illiberalism Studies Program at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at GW. Delighted to have you here with us today. Our program is leading in researching and conceptualizing this notion of illiberalism. We look at it in its entanglement with other notions such as liberalism. We look at the articulation with populism, conservatism, authoritarianism, and the far right. We have been publishing a lot on the topics. I invite you to look at our website. We also just released the Oxford Handbook of Illiberalism with about 45 chapters on the concept. We are currently preparing an index of illiberalism that will be looking at countries' legislation and public opinion, mostly for the broader Europe. We are also preparing or pushing for more research being done on the grassroots domains for illiberalism, which we see as the kind of new frontier in terms of research. We're also working on a new initiative that we will be launching in a few weeks on illiberalism and environment, looking at the structuring of conservative environmentalism and climate change delayisms, as is formulated now. So we have a broad spectrum of research going around that notion. But today we're here to discuss the transnational links of this illiberal phenomenon. As we all know, it's a global something. It's globally happening, but it's always done for homegrown domestic reasons. Yet you still can see international linkage at all the levels, being kind of state solidarity, transnational organization, far-right entrepreneur, circulation of ideas, of themes, of cultural fashion, people-to-people connection. So what we want to do with you today is to make sense of this dense web of intricate relationship, which are both impacting the so-called liberal international order, but also are impacting each of the domestic contexts, especially in Europe, where you have both influences coming from both the US and Russia, for example. So what we will be doing with you today and tomorrow is to try to unpack all that, and we will have several panels and a very dense discussion. I would like to thank all those who have been flying from Europe to join us for that conference. It was a long trip, and we will begin now with our keynote speaker, Zack Beauchamp, who is a senior, I pronounce it very French way, who is a senior correspondent at Vox, where he covers challenges to democracy in the United States and abroad, right-wing populism, and the world of ideas. He has received funding awards from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting to report on democratic decline in Israel and Hungary, and is the author On the Right, a newsletter on the American conservative movement. He has been widely appearing on several television, radio network, and podcasts, and he recently published a few months ago his book on democracy called The Reactionary Spirit, which is why we contacted him and asking to kind of launch the discussion for our conference. So Zack, thank you so much for joining us today. I will give you the floor for some opening remark, and then we will have time for a Q&A, and then we will move to our first panel. So please join me in welcoming Zack.
Thanks for that really lovely introduction. This is a bit of a homecoming for me. I moved out of DC, I'm going to say about 2.5 months ago. I live in Canada. I'm following my wife, who is a professor there. Got to do the two-body problem, only with a journalist rather than an academic. I will say my last name is not pronounced in the French way, though living in Canada, I get it all the time. So at this point, I'm just used to it. But look, like anybody who just published a book, I'm going to talk about my book. But I'm not only going to talk about my book. What I want to do is, with this audience, whose opinions, I know some of you, all of you have expertise and opinions that I care about, I want to lay out 3 puzzles in the world of anti-democratic politics. I then want to talk about how I tried to address those puzzles in my book and how it structured those puzzles. And then the last part of my talk, which I think personally is the part I care the most about, I want to lay out the things that I think I didn't answer to my own satisfaction. The things where I wasn't quite sure about what to say, or I didn't think there was enough existing scholarship to draw firm conclusions. And I want to pose those as the sort of ordering, structuring questions for the conversation that we're going to have after the talk. Okay, So the puzzles. Right now, I think there's little dispute that we are in the middle of an era of democratic crisis and rising illiberalism. Right? That's sort of the premise of this conversation, the whole reason this conference exists. But there are a few puzzles about the way in which that's manifesting that I think are different or not well explained by a lot of the theoretical or empirical studies that exist on the topic. The first one, why is this happening in established democracies? So in previous waves of democracy, you have this whole literature about consolidated democracies and how democracies, once they reach a certain point of economic development or a long enough history of democratic traditions, that they become functionally impervious to democratic backsliding. That's not the case, right? We know that's not the case now because there are a number of different countries. I would single out two clear examples, Turkey and Hungary, as examples of countries that had reached many of the benchmarks associated with democratic consolidation and fell backwards. What used to be an iron law of democratization and democracy studies is no longer holds. So that, I would say, is the first puzzle of what's going on. The second one is why the wave of activity of anti-democratic politics that we're seeing in the modern world or in these advanced democracies is overwhelmingly left-wing. Right here, I think a lot of the existing theories fall flat because a lot of them center on populism as a term. And I think there's reason for that, right? Populism has a tendency to divide the world, I mean, sort of definitionally, into a virtuous elite versus a virtuous public versus a non-virtuous, evil, scheming elite. And that nature of politics lends itself to a kind of antagonism that seems fundamentally at odds with liberalism's idea of a sort of core shared democratic polity, a fair system of cooperation, as John Rawls would put it. But that's not been the case, right? Historically, there are plenty of populisms that work within the democratic context and didn't pose any significant threats, either to the liberal structure in the sense of basic fundamental rights like freedom of speech, or to the democratic character of the states in which they're happening. So a populist rhetorical mode can't be the explanation here. And we in the media often use populism as a shorthand, when what we're trying to talk about, and I think a lot of reporters are wary about saying openly, is right-wing anti-democratic politics. That's what I focused on in my book, trying to explain and where I sort of used as a starting point, because there are cases, right, of backsliding coming from non-right-wing sources in modernity. Venezuela, I think, is an especially good example. But they tend to be less rule than exception, right? Is if you look at the commonality between the countries that we cite as the key loci of democratic backsliding, we're talking United States, talking Hungary, you're talking Israel, Poland, India. The parties responsible all come from a right-wing theoretical background, or at least political orientation. So I'd say that's one other major test question. And then the last one that I think any decent theory of what's happening right now needs to explain is why the institutional form of this kind of anti-democratic politics takes the character that it does. So what I mean by that is not, do they flourish more in systems, multi-party systems, in two-party systems? Are they better off in more successful in presidential systems than parliamentary ones? I actually think those factors, which comparative political science often leans on, have been very poorly predictive in the current wave of anti-democratic backsliding. Look at Israel, which is a purely majoritarian proportional system. Then look at the United States, which is not a multi-party system, not proportional, first past the post, and has two major parties. Right? Both of them are two of the poster children for modern illiberal backsliding today, or anti-democratic backsliding. Institutional arrangements could not be more different. It suggests to me that the traditional institutional explanations don't fit. Maybe they matter at the margins, but the Juan Lin style arguments about presidentialism are not at the core of what's happening right now. So when I talk about regime type and institutional arrangements, what I mean is the mechanisms through which democratic backsliding and anti-democratic politics manifest themselves. So if you go back and read the foundational writings of anti-democratic political movements in the past, they will almost assuredly openly declare their hostility to democracy. So this isn't just the early period or early stage, people like Tristan de Maistre talking about, see, there's my French pronunciation going mad again, talking about how they openly believe that monarchy should never have been overthrown and calling for the Bourbon Restoration. But even up to and including the fascist period, right? Fascist leaders, they talked about themselves as being representatives of the people and the will of the people, and in that sense are often treated as kind of an outgrowth of the democratic era. But if you read fascist writings, that's not what they say about democracy at all. That's not how they see themselves. They are tribunes of the people, but the people are not understood in democratic terms. They have nothing but scorn for democracy, which they believe is rule of the weak, rule of the mob, the pathetic, uninformed, divided population. Fascism is a politics of the united people, whose united will is determined by the political leader who represents the state in an almost organic way, right? So that led to was the justification for a frontal assault on democratic systems. You ended up getting, look at how fascist institutions were arranged, right? One party rule, not just one party, one man rule, harsh crackdowns of dissent, no pretense of democratic politics after they initially acquired power. This is a very, very different kind of institutional setup as compared to the sort of governments that are experiencing backsliding right now. Let's use Hungary as an example here, right? Over and over and over again, no matter how much he is pushed, Viktor Orban will insist that he is a Democrat, that his politics are democratic, and that his regime is an example of democracy. Now, he'll use a different adjective to describe whatever kind of democracy it is. He started with illiberal democracy. He moved off of that one because it sounded a little threatening, and has now pivoted to Christian democracy as the primary description, but he'll often say in speeches, Christian or illiberal democracy. It's sort of just changed so you can't quote it as easily. He's very attentive to how scholars and journalists would approach this. And his institutional arrangements are similarly subtle. Right? The way that authoritarianism works in Hungary is not typically sending police to somebody's home, as many of you can attest to better than I can, honestly. The arrangements are subtle. They're created through manipulation of the electoral system, through mechanisms like gerrymandering, through using tools like regulatory powers and tax powers to punish businessmen who speak out of turn, to withholding advertising dollars from media outlets unless they sell to government-friendly alliances, and through the sort of cumulative, additive effect of these different procedural moves, most of which are designed, incidentally, to look a lot like reforms that you might see in a fully liberal democracy. So taken in isolation, each one might be justifiable. Cumulatively, when you put them together, what you end up is a situation where the government dominates discussion and the system is so rigged against political opponents and so difficult to operate either in civil society or through the electoral system that you functionally can't describe as a democracy anymore. It's not exactly clear when Hungary crossed that bright line. I think by the time of the 2014 election, it was fairly clear, at least to sort of really deeply informed observers, but that's a characteristic of this politics. You can't say, this is the moment, this law that you passed is the one that ended democracy. There's nothing like the Enabling Act that was passed under Hitler. So I want to return to that theme at the end, because I think it's very important, and one of the areas in which there needs to be more work done. But for now, I think that explaining why we're seeing this kind of illiberalism, one that uses the language of democracy rather than positioning itself against democracy in the way that previous illiberal right-wing movements have done, is essential to any adequate theory of what is happening right now. Okay, so those are our puzzles. Now I'm going to try to answer them briefly, using the framework that I set up in the book. So first, why establish democracies? Well, the argument that I make, again, in the reactionary spirit, centers on this concept of the reactionary spirit, which is that in a democratic society, there's always tension between the egalitarian promises of the state and the lived reality of a society structured by social hierarchy. There are going to be people in those societies who want to use politics as a means of altering the distribution of power, wealth, and status. And there are going to be people who think that the existing distribution of power, wealth, and status is justified. That in and of itself is basic democratic politics. That's the way that things are. But I think it can give rise, that tension, to anti-democratic politics on either the left or the right. On the left, that takes the form of people saying, democracy is not moving fast enough. Democracy can't level hierarchies because of the nature of, because democracy itself is indebted to those hierarchies. The most classic formulation of that is Marxist arguments about democracy as a bourgeois system, right? About how the capitalist class controls the levers of power and only a revolution can overthrow them. On the right, it's the exact opposite. People who think that democracy inherently tends towards equality, and thus democracy itself is the problem. That democracy is at the heart of these leveling tendencies that challenge the distribution of power and wealth and status that they find so admirable. I don't really develop the left portion of that in the book because it's not really what it's about. I would like to at one point, but I haven't. The right portion is the focus, again, for the reason set up in my second half of the puzzle. Why right-wing movements? Well, because the end of the 20th century was the most egalitarian time in human history. Never has there ever been, across human society, such a fast, rapid, and thorough leveling of social hierarchy. This includes everything from the creation of the modern welfare state to the advances of the modern feminist movement, to mass immigration, changing the demographic character of societies, making groups that were once colonial subjects of European powers into participants in their societies, to even more subtle and country-specific challenges, right? Things like the civil rights movement in the United States, the peace process in Israel in the 1990s, the creation of an Indian constitution that outlawed untouchability. All these are examples, I argue, of a universal ideological tendency, right? I think that the reactionaries, they got something right? There is a tendency in democracy to promote egalitarian change. There is something about democracy that really intrinsically opens up opportunities for egalitarian social change. And so it's no surprise to me, thinking about it through this lens, that what I call the reactionary spirit, which is the tendency to see democracy at the heart of this egalitarianism that people on the right are generally worried about, though to differing degrees, and to react against it, right? To feel a need to overthrow it and to stop it. Well, all right, what are those changes? Well, my argument, and this is really an empirical question, so the only way to sort through it is by looking at various different empirical studies, is that this is primarily rooted in social phenomena. There is not that much evidence at present that the current wave of far-right anti-democratic politics is being fueled by economic anxieties, right? There's a sort of opposite theory of the case to mine that says, well, what happened at the end of the 20th century was actually a move towards inequality, right, in terms of wealth via the neoliberal movement. And that made a lot of people very angry, a lot of people very discontent with the way the system is operating. And that's manifesting in voting for right-wing parties. I don't think this theory fits the empirical evidence very well, right? There have been a number of different studies, large and statistical studies, often very careful ones using natural experiments that can tease out the differences between an economic and a socially or culturally based explanation, one that prioritizes features like backlashes against immigration, hostility to LGBT rights, or a sense that the traditional notion of the family is being overthrown. A commitment to old school racial politics, right? These things, I think in country after country, we've seen a number of really impressively done statistical evidence, putting economic causes, not throwing them out entirely, but suggesting that it's not democracy's failures to achieve equality that have fueled an illiberal movement, but its successes in leveling hierarchies that have led to the conflict we see right now. And I think incidentally that's supported by the lack of far left anti-democratic movements, right? In an era where you see a politics defined by material antagonism, you'd expect far left politics to have much more of an appeal, and far left anti-democratic politics specifically. It doesn't, right? It's very weak in, again, most of the world. This is a totalizing analysis and there are differences. But remember the universe of cases that I'm talking about here is advanced democracies, countries that might previously have been considered consolidated states, or consolidated democratic states, right? There are plenty of places that are not that in which far left anti-democratic politics flourish. So I want to focus again on the scope condition here. I'll problematize that at the end, but right now we're still relating it the sake of me advancing the argument. So that explains the first two puzzles. Why is this happening in established democracies? Well, because they're the ones that have had the most significant ideological change, the ones that have been most subject to the leveling pressures of the late 20th and early 21st century. And they're the places where, this is adding, I guess, post-material politics are most dominant. By that I mean material concerns have become less significant because of, as Pippin Norris and Ron Engelhardt have argued in their work for quite a few decades now, we've achieved a level of prosperity in a lot of those countries. Certainly I'm speaking now of Atlantic democracies, where the experience of extreme poverty is not as widespread and not as mobilizing. That's just different in a country like India, and indeed, we can bracket that, but India has experienced simultaneously both the leveling pressures that advanced wealthy democracies have had, while also retaining significant material conflict, which just creates a much more complicated sub-national picture of Indian politics. But at the national level, the trends much more interestingly resemble a Western or Atlantic democracy than they do some other countries that otherwise fit India's socio-democratic profile, or socio-demographic, excuse me. So now the last question, why this regime type? And that goes back to the ideological argument that I set up earlier, which is, well, the leveling egalitarian doctrine that came to dominate the world as democracy spread in the late 20th and early 21st century is intimately bound up in democracy's ideological promise. Democracy as a political system is posited on the idea that everyone who lives under the democratic system is a political equal. That is, that they deserve not to rule other people by virtue of some feature of birth, by some characteristic that they've not chosen, but they deserve to rule in cooperation with others, again, in society as a fair system of cooperation between equals. So as democracy spread, and democracy became part of egalitarian politics, right? And democracy itself achieved a level of ideological hegemony, I think still Brooks' relatively limited challenge. You see very, very few comparative movements. Julian is going to get mad at me for saying this, he's challenged me on this before, but I still think it's true. Very, very few international movements promising to bring a Chinese system to their country, which are winning elections on the platform of we're going to make our country like China, right? Whereas democratic ideas and democratic language and discourse still dominate not just international politics, but often revolutionary politics in authoritarian regimes, right? Look at, for instance, the recent Iranian resistance movement, woman, freedom, life, the demand centering on equality and democracy is the core of what they wanted, what they wanted from the Iranian government. This ideal occupies a space in the global political conversation that no other ideological system can come close to challenging. There is nothing like communism or fascism today on the horizon. And as a result, even authoritarian movements inside democracies, where democracy, by the way, is strongest polling-wise, there's really still, despite discontent with democratic outputs, strong support in polling for democracy as a, broadly speaking, system of government. They have to play within the rules of the democratic game. They can't present as being anti-democratic because that would invite backlash from their own citizens, even many of their own supporters. Witness the past week, right? You have John Kelly, who is Trump's former chief of staff. That'd be pretty funny if Trump had a mustache. John Kelly, Trump's former chief of staff, calling him a fascist, right? And what's the response to that? It's not, yeah, he's a fascist and that's good. Fascist is a slur. It's an insult. It's to say, from his supporters, there's no way Kelly said that, or if he did say that, Kelly is lying. I had one person tell me that John Kelly was being funded by Ukraine to say that, right? It is clear that you can't run as that kind of overt anti-democrat in a country like the United States. Hence the need for competitive authoritarianism as a mode of challenge, as a way of presenting itself. That's why you try to build a system like Viktor Orban's. Why Orban, and Hungary, by the way, is a country where there is surprisingly still a strong majority for democracy. Or perhaps not that surprisingly, since it's only been about 2 or 3 decades where Hungary's been a democracy at all. And people still really believe in it. They have living memory of the alternatives that they don't like. So even as it is backslid into authoritarianism, most Hungarians say that they want to live under a democratic regime, that they support it. And that's true in all of the countries that I've surveyed. I've been focusing, by the way, on the US, India, Israel, and Hungary, because those are my case studies in the book. So, bracket that. Now, Let's go to the self-critical part of the talk. What didn't I answer? What did this framework, what parts of the puzzle does this framework not fully address, or where would I like to see or hear more feedback from others? So I think the first question challenges the premise itself. Is advanced democracies the right scope condition? Right? Is it true that the countries that we should be looking at and comparing to each other are countries that have long democratic histories, high, middle, or high incomes, and generally fit the profile of a country that you would consider a relatively well-established democracy? Well, maybe there are reasons for that approach, but it also could be the case that phenomena that are happening in low-income countries or relatively new democracies have a lot more, or even have a lot to tell us about what's happening in wealthier and established democracies than a framework like the one that I've set out presents. Do I know if that's true? No. No, but I think I would be really interested in seeing really careful studies trying to understand what exactly we can infer from experiences, for instance, in the quote-unquote coup belt in Central Africa, for experiences for democracy in other parts of the world. Generally speaking, these things get siloed in the political conversation. And there's reason for that, right? There's no prospect of a military coup in the United States, or in Hungary, or in India. That's not how politics works, for the reasons I just outlined. But that doesn't mean that the nature of democratic decay or dissatisfaction with democracy might not be similar in some regard. So I think that that's one area where I would have liked to push myself more, and where I'd like to see more pushes going forward. Second question is on the relationship between the right and democracy. Now, unlike some other observers, I don't think that conservatism is coextensive with support for anti-democratic politics. I think that that is a totally unreasonable of the role that conservative parties have played in Western democracy, and in non-Western democracy for that matter. Just largely inconsistent with the empirical data. I do think, though, that there is a genuine difficulty in trying to assess when a far-right party is an anti-democratic party and when it isn't. And I think this is really essential for democracy, is understanding this part of the story. Because democracy depends on the idea that people can legitimately debate all sorts of public topics, even if certain rights are bracketed off and protected by institutions like courts. You know, it should be the case that democratic publics get to debate immigration. It should be the case that they get to debate even extreme policies towards immigration that shut off immigration to a trickle, or maybe even close off immigration entirely. I personally vehemently oppose such policies. I am currently an immigrant myself, but I don't know that it should be I don't think it should be out of bounds, and I don't think that the slippage in saying that because some far-right parties, like Fidesz, are anti-democratic, therefore all far-right parties are anti-democratic, works. Or even that there have been far-right authoritarian factions in the past, and therefore we can assume that all far-right parties pose some level of authoritarian threat in the future. I think that's also not true, right? In Europe's recent history, there are far-right parties that have participated in coalition governments, have accepted electoral defeat, and have done so without posing significant threat to the democratic order, either through legislation they've passed or in their behavior after elections. One question I have, that I don't have an answer to, is how we know the difference, right? How do we know that once in power, a far-right party can be trusted to behave responsibly? Right? How do we know that a far-left party can be trusted to behave responsibly? When parties are at the extremes of a political spectrum, it becomes very difficult to understand their relationship to the democratic mainstream, if the mainstream is defined by support for elements of the political status quo. I don't know if there's a hard and fast rubric for that. I do know that there's been relatively little work, at least that I've seen, trying to establish the conditions under which a far-right party is likely to act in an anti-democratic way upon taking power. That's something I'd like to see more of. Now, the last challenge. Are we good enough at distinguishing competitive authoritarianism from a garden variety flawed democracy, or democracy with some problems? I found this really difficult when I was working on the book. By the end of it, I ended up, going back to my 4 case studies, putting them on a spectrum. The United States was still a democracy, clearly, though one with significant threats. Hungary had at one point, crossed the line, though as I alluded to earlier, I'm not quite sure when exactly. Was it after the passage of constitutional amendments or the new constitution immediately after Orban took power in 2010 after winning the 2010 election? Was it a few years after that when media consolidation had really taken hold? I don't, it doesn't work that way, right? You don't pinpoint a bright line, and yet you need to be able to say, as anyone who's worked on coding for these kind of things does, is this state democratic or not? Right? Like, where do we put it in the system? Like, Freedom or Freedom House? And there's not, the language that we have was largely developed in a time prior to the emergence of this form of authoritarianism, or at least prior to its emergence on a mass global scale as one of the defining elements of the international political order. Right? We've had competitive authoritarianism for quite some time. My argument in the book is that the first example of it that can be sort of clearly defined as such is the Jim Crow South, right, which functioned as a subnational competitive authoritarian system. That's the clearest to me. There are some other cases, right? One argument would be France under Napoleon III, but we can, actually wait, this is an academic conference, we can't set aside equivalent, I'm sure it'll happen. But that left the other two countries, right? We had the United States on one end of the flawed but still democratic system, and Hungary on the other end. And so, where do we put India and Israel? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the things that made them undemocratic, the sources of anti-democracy inside their polities, well, similar in some key respects, both oriented around ethno-religious antagonism, both oriented around, well, excluding Muslims primarily, both of which took place in terms of efforts to suborn the press, both of which were happening amidst institutions that were vigorously resisting them. There were also a lot of important differences that made it difficult to say one was less democratic than the other one. It's difficult to know what to do with Israel's occupation of the Palestinians when you're coding something like that, because that's clearly a military regime. But if you were to separate that out and just look at Israel within its traditional borders, this was all done prior to the Gaza war, which I think complicates things further. But looking at Israel inside its traditional borders, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say it was a less functional democracy than India's. Likewise, India is a federal system. And federal systems, as some of the conference participants here have argued, are much harder to authoritarianize from the top than a country like Hungary or Israel, where almost all of the major functions of state are done at the national level because they're small primarily. And in India, there's significant subnational resistance to autocratization under Narendra Modi, where you can see this in regional elections. You can see it in the way that opposition parties managed to form a sort of patchwork coalition, not in the way that the Israeli opposition parties formed, but one with locally based hegemony, right? Parties like the current ruling party in West Bengal and its leader, Mamata Banerjee, is incredibly popular there and has a difficult to displace base of support, which allowed for this sort of trans-ideological opposition alliance to be more effective in a lot of ways and more coherent in some other ways than its equivalents in Israel. So how do you compare the level of democracy in these two countries? Is it just an intrinsic problem to trying to think about how to code democracy? Or do we need better concepts for a world in which anti-democratic politics is intentionally muddying the waters between democracy and non-democracy? I don't know what the answer to that is, but I would love to hear if any of you do. Thank you very much for listening to this.
Great presentation, a lot of food for thought, and I now would like to open the floor and maybe let me launch the discussion by kind of continuing on the same element that you were mentioning. I was especially interested about your point on, Hungarians still believe democracy as a best system, right? And how much does that tell us about, and that's on what you conclude, this kind of binary between democracy and authoritarianism is a problematic one, is that how much, for some people, an authoritarian direction is the best way to make democracy functioning.
Yeah.
Right? So the question of democracy being governable, functioning, and delivering services has to be done by more authoritarian and illiberal solution, and how much it's Because I think we see that pretty clearly when we look at Western European surveys where there is a big rise of demand for, I don't want to say authoritarianism, but for authority inside democracy. What is that telling us about not only that our concepts are problematic, but also that people want authority to make democracy better, not to get rid of democracy, right? And also, how do we deal with the gap between, because you were looking at least for the US or a kind of established liberal democracy, how do we deal with the gap between what is liberal, what is democracy? Also looking at some surveys that we have now among European youth of being more liberal in the sense more individualistic, wanted privacy, right to decide who you like, who you are, but less trusting toward institution. So more liberal on value, more illiberal or toward authority in. So how do we deal, do you think, with all these kind of nuances? And maybe another element that you mentioned on your first discussion on democracy goes with more kind of egalitarian pressure. At the same time, there is a feeling of growing social inequality among all the well-established Western society. And I was wondering, at the beginning you mentioned, in a sense, time, between the leftist vision of the world and the social order and the right. And I wonder how much it's also the perception of the future that matter. That are you pessimistic or optimistic, right? Do you imagine a future through decline? Or can we still imagine a future that is positive and optimistic? And I wonder how much this perception of time is not also something that dissociates the kind of far left answer to a kind of rightist answer to the challenges of, where are we going? So how utopia is part of our vision of the world, right? On how we can transform it or not. So if you could maybe just to launch the discussion, and then I open the floor.
Sure. So I'll take each of those parts in a different order. I'll try to, as far as I understood your questions, bracket them to 3 parts. I like threes. The first one is about this question of visions of utopia. I think you're right that a lot of the traditional appeal of the left has been its optimism about the future. But I think a lot of that is lacking in modern left-wing movements. Right? There's a tremendous amount of pessimism, of doomerism, as people might say now in vernacular discourse, going on among the left. Right? And I think that may be politically disabling and may be part of the explanation as to why radical left-wing movements are comparatively weak at the moment. I think here Israel is an especially telling example. One thing that you hear when you go on the ground and you speak to people involved in left-wing Israeli movements is that the reason they've been unable to present a viable alternative to the far right currently in power is that they don't have a leadership class that's capable of doing that. And it's not, they say that, I think it gets them off the hook a little bit in a way, because they're saying, like, it's not our fault, activists on the ground, it's just the people who are supposed to be in charge of us. Well, shouldn't you be in charge of you? But not to blame them, they're in a tough spot. But what it speaks to is just these movements have a lot of difficulty coming up with a vision, or at least in Israel, a positive vision for the future that addresses the flaws, at least perceived by the Israeli public, of the left in the past. Right? And I think that actually is true in a lot of different places. There are different flaws. Like in Israel, they're deeply tied to security failures. But in the Atlantic world, has a great deal to do with communism's failures to deliver on its promises and to do much worse to its population. And that blow to the left, the failure of what was its positive, hopeful vision, has made it difficult for radical left movements to mobilize. On the first point that you raised about voters wanting democracy to sort of serve as a form of authority, right? Not necessarily authoritarianism, but Democrats to act in a authority-imposing manner. I found a lot of really interesting research on this subject relating to Southeast Asia. Tom Popinski at Cornell has done, I think, really helpful work describing what he calls, I believe, I'm going to mangle a little bit, but it's democracy against disorder. Right? Tom's argument is that Southeast Asian voters were very concerned about crime, about violence, and what they wanted out of their leaders, and why you've seen the rise of figures like Rodrigo Duterte and various different Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand is another example. Right? Is their ability to promise that once elected, they will deliver hard, aggressive policies that may not follow the letter of the law, but will get things done in terms of delivering for the citizens a sense of quality of life and of, normalcy in their everyday life. This isn't always responsive to like actual political problems out in the world. Like Duterte would talk a lot about the drug problem in the Philippines, whereas if you look at by sort of comparative standards, the Philippine rate of drug use and drug crime was relatively average, right? It wasn't extraordinary by international comparisons in any rate. Another good example, right? Maybe the best contemporary example of this appeal is in El Salvador today. Nayib Bukele's politics are all about this. And so, of course, the question is like when Bukele also shows that this can really quickly verge into out and out authoritarianism. Like the man literally sent the army into Congress, right? At one point where Congress wouldn't do what he was doing. So the line between those two things can be very blurry, even if that's what the voters want. And then the last point you raised about liberalism and democracy, this is obviously like a gigantic topic, and we could talk about it for the rest of the thing. What I want to just say briefly is my approach to thinking about those things, which is that it's not necessarily that all liberal rights are democratic rights, or that there's no tension between the two concepts. There's a lot of tension, right? There's a lot of political theory, really good political theory, political philosophy written on these topics. But there are clear areas where what might be classified as a liberal right really isn't essential to democracy right. I think freedom of the press is the most obvious one, right? That if you're really working to curtail freedom of the press, what you're doing is undermining the foundations of the democratic system to the point that when you're done, even if you were elected democratically, the system can no longer be meaningfully described as democracy. So you can call it a liberal or call it anti-democratic. I don't really care, because it's the same thing in those cases. It's destroying the ability for self-rule among the population. So there can be illiberal politics that are not anti-democratic. That was the point I was making earlier about some European far-right parties. But much of what we call illiberalism today is essentially and by its nature anti-democratic. So I didn't see much of a need to dwell on those finer points of distinction because I wanted to focus on the anti-democratic component of it. But that does cover an opposition to a large slate of what we might otherwise call liberal rights.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Let's open the floor for questions. There will be a mic in the room, and please introduce yourself. Julian.
Julian Waller, GW. Thanks, Zack. This is fantastic. I look forward to reading your book. I haven't read it yet.
Everyone should read it.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Let me ask you the doomer question, right? If we're talking in the vernacular, as you'd say. Okay, if it is the case that democracy has inherent egalitarian impulses that redistribute wealth and status and power and privilege and position in society, and this is just baked into the cake, and that there is natural organic reactions to this, and they're expressed through the political system, and they're going to have anti-democratic components, and this is an age of unprecedented change in terms of the redistribution of wealth and status and power and privilege and so on. Is democracy doomed?
Yeah, great question. I think the answer is no. Okay. And I think the reason why the answer is no is that element of democratic ideological hegemony, right, is that this is sort of the last two chapters of the book are really consumed by this question specifically. Because democracy remains so popular and people really care about it, right, and the authoritarian movements don't challenge it frontally, that creates inherent vulnerabilities for those movements because they are authoritarian, right, in their nature. That's what they're advocating. It's the kind of solution that they're presenting. And so when voters are exposed to that contradiction, or when they can be convinced that there's a contradiction between the democratic rhetoric these people are offering and the anti-democratic reality of their politics, then you can actually persuade a great deal of voters who may be unhappy with elements of the status quo to reject it. So I think, for Americans, the most vivid example of this, we just saw it a week ago, less, on the campaign trail. It is Liz Cheney sharing a platform with Kamala Harris to argue against Donald Trump on grounds that January 6th was bad. Now, like many people in this room, I do not approve of Liz Cheney's political choices in the past. But there's something extraordinary about having somebody like her, with her conservative bona fides, up saying, look, I need to vote for a Democrat whose vision of politics is 180 degrees opposed to me on virtually every issue of substance, except for democracy, right? Except for this one thing. And we know that that appeal works, right? This is something you've seen some challenges. This isn't appealing to the right kind of voters. Well, most studies of the 2022 US midterms showed that that really was decisive in changing the outcome. Specifically in races with gubernatorial and state secretary of state candidates, people who like really were in charge of the machinery of democracy, people in those roles who challenged the legitimacy of the 2020 election, all lost, every single one of them, right? And when you talk to candidates who were involved in those races, they'll tell you the nonpartisan democracy appeal is extremely effective in reaching moderate voters. We can also see this in other cross-national cases. The 2022 Brazilian presidential election, I think, is a really strong example, to the point where you can trace support coming from the center-right party that did not make the runoff, throwing its support wholesale towards Lula in a very Liz Cheney-like moment on the grounds of democracy. The amount of supporters that that party got in the first round of elections was more than the amount that Lula ended up winning by in the one-on-one race against Bolsonaro. That is to say, without the center-right defecting and joining a pro-democracy coalition, Bolsonaro may have gotten a second term, right, and been able to continue the democratic backsliding that had been ongoing at the first. There are several other examples. I think the Polish election is a decent example. So too have been some recent Czech election results. But all of them suggest that democracy is quite a powerful mobilizing issue. And there are a variety of different ways to get at that. And one thing I try to do in the book is to detail not just that this is true, but try to identify strategies that have worked for using democracy as a wedge issue.
So Gulnaz, then the lady in the back. Gulnaz first, the lady in the back.
Nassim Katulina from University of Amsterdam. Maybe a little bit of a naive question, but again, building on the same premise of egalitarianism being built into democracy, you would expect that the communities that benefit from this redistribution will be always pro-democratic. Think about the women, or think about Hispanic communities also. But you do see that they still do vote, and now seems like increasingly so, against the democracy. So basically against the system that have given them indeed a lot of the benefits and the positives. How would you explain that?
Yeah,
Thanks.
Great question. Great question. One that I think about all the time. Part of the answer, honestly, is that my theory of politics isn't it doesn't explain everything, right? It's like there are other things going on besides the push and pull over democracy and egalitarianism that voters care about. Any individual election often has factors like whether or not a particular candidate is perceived as corrupt, whether or not the economy is doing well. They're just outside the scope conditions of a general theory like the one I'm presenting. So I'm not like saying that all voters mechanistically follow the laws of politics as I've outlined them. That being said, there are some internal explanations, because if there weren't, it would be a huge problem for the theory. And one of them is relative status competition. So you raised the example of Hispanics in the United States, right? When you look at what a lot of the sort of really hardcore MAGA types among the Hispanic community, the way they talk about these things, they're strikingly similar to the way that many of the white voters or longtime white voters, native-born whites, talk about immigration, right? They say, we came here legally, our ancestors followed the rules, these people don't. They'll also talk about crime among Black people in very similar language, right? So what you see is there, and this has been validated both by some research, some demographic research, right, showing that people whose families have been in the United States for longer tend to identify less as Hispanic, or list as rather non-white Hispanic, more as white Hispanic, and tend to be more likely to vote for Trump, right? You also will see some evidence that there are, among people who identify as Latino or Hispanic, right-wing conservatives, not just conservative, but right-wing conservatives particularly, they tend to score high on racial resentment and other tests like that, used to identify intragroup competition. So part of it is an expression of relative status competition, of saying that I identify or I understand myself to be better off with the existing, even though I came from a group that may have once been excluded from the polity entirely or marginalized from it, that I see myself and identify myself much more with the majority group, not necessarily due to material benefits, but sometimes even just identity-based affiliation or ideological coherence or belief in the values, the system, the concepts articulated by dominant groups. So identity is really complicated, and it can shift in a lot of different ways. And tracing those different identity lines and the way that they change among different populations, I think is essential to understanding the nuances of reactionary politics.
Wonderful. Let's go back there to Sam, and then we come back to you. And back again.
Sam Goldman, GW. Zack, I'm still trying to understand better the categories that you're applying. So I want to read you a quote, and you tell me if it reflects a democratic or authoritarian perspective. Play a little game. I'll read the quote, and then you can tell me who it's from. So the quote is, "There is no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, especially around our democracy." So you know who said this.
Yeah, that's John Kerry.
No.
Oh, is it?
This is Tim Walz. So this is the nominee.
John Kerry just said the same thing. Yeah.
I'm sure. I mean, many have said similar things. So the nominee of a major party with a reasonable chance of becoming the second highest ranking executive official says there is no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, especially around our democracy. So is that democratic or anti-democratic?
Yeah, another great question. I think that the issue of how you handle hate speech is one of those democracy liberalism tensions that is perennial and part of the democratic game and very, very, very difficult to resolve abstractly. So, like, copying to my biases here, I'm American, and because I'm an American liberal and sort of my basic political values, I find that kind of thing troubling, right? I find, despite being Jewish, I find Holocaust denial criminalization in Germany to be an offense against free speech, or at least an inadvisable way of corralling things, but I understand why Germans would think of it differently, right? I think this is an issue on which reasonable people in a democracy can differ, right? And reasonable approaches to understanding the contours and the limits of free speech can diverge. That said, it obviously can be taken too far. And all of that is about the details, right? There's a point at which you label everything you disagree with hate speech, and you end up using that as a justification for ending democracy functionally or ending free speech. Is there any place where that's actually happened? Calling it hate speech? I can't think of one. I can't think of any empirical case in which that's taken place. That's not to say it's not theoretically possible, and it would be bad if it did. It's just that it's not happened. It's not, as a matter of empirical fact, a concern that I have to reckon with. I am concerned that it wouldn't end free speech, the sort of kinds of things that Tim Walz is talking about there, but that it could go too far in restricting speech that ought to be protected. But here we're back in the very, very normal game of democratic politics, the kind of thing that is the Supreme Court goes back and forth on over the course of the decades. Different state regulators have different approaches, and we fight about that within the contours of democratic politics. We have mechanisms for dealing with those disputes, not just court cases, but also protests, going to state and federal legislators and calling for different laws. Like, as long as all of that stuff is still permissible and still functional and viable, then debates about hate speech are exactly the kind of debate we should be having in a democracy. But at the moment when those fundamental democratic building blocks are being challenged, when hate speech all of a sudden includes advocating for another party, right, or for basic planks of its platform, which I know some people argue Walz is defining pro-Republican or pro-Trump speech as hate speech. That would indeed be a problem. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think it's very clear from context of those comments. That's not what he's saying. Or Kerry, as I guess I might have said a second ago. And so that when those rights are denied, we're firmly in anti-democratic territory. And judging which is which is honestly just a contextual question.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Maria Skora, and I'm usually based in Berlin, but this semester at Johns Hopkins University at the American German Institute. Thank you so much for your keynote, and I have a following question to you. Well, you've said that people in general and majority support democracy, and I see it's true for the US. Pew Research proves that, and Germany is the same. However, we have this paradox, right, that illiberal or anti-democratic candidates, leaders, politicians still either win elections or are very probable to win elections. I'm talking about the US, but I'm also talking about Hungary. Even if you take Polish election into consideration, last year, the opposition managed to form a majority government, right? Law and justice is still very strong. So to the point, my question is, and I'd like to know your opinion on this paradox, How is it that people support democracy, however, still support illiberal or anti-democratic leaders? Is it maybe one of the possible answers that people want to, are happy with free market economy and some liberal civil liberties, but would or remain indifferent to the procedural aspect, procedural dimension of democracy, which is democratic institutions, procedures, and so on, so on. So how would you explain that?
Yeah, I think the answer is that they don't think it's anti-democratic, right? Is that the tactics that are used to mask anti-democratic politics to make it look like democracy are working. They're working as intended for a lot of these parties. Some of it is because they haven't gotten a chance to wield power, right? In Germany, right, the AfD is only now winning regional elections recently and hasn't gotten a chance to govern at the national level. Maybe it never will, so we'll have difficulty assessing, though I think AfD is clearly on the anti-democratic side of the European far-right spectrum. But they're kind of over, they're not very good at hiding it in a lot of ways. But other parties are, and I think that that's fundamental to their ability to operate in a context where most people value democracies. Right? And if they can't do that, well, they tend to lose elections on grounds that people think they're not democratic. Or they can't do it well enough, or else maybe the opposition is worse or less competent. That happens in other cases too. Again, these theoretical dynamics are the totality of politics, but they are a major part of it. And that sort of gets back to my answer to Julian's question, right? Which is that a lot of the push and pull in modern democracies that are risky or at risk of backsliding is between parties, both people. Essentially, look at the US election right now, right? Trump's stock response to him being called a fascist or authoritarian is, I'm not the fascist, you're the fascist, right? Kamala is, or look at the way that during the vice presidential debate, when J.D. Vance was challenged on not certifying the 2020 election, he went back to talking about efforts to address misinformation during COVID, arguing that was an abuse of government power and itself anti-democratic, which actually maybe it wasn't, maybe it was, right? Like Vance may have a point on that particular thing being not a wise or effective use of democracy, but note that it doesn't answer the question, right? It doesn't answer the question of whether or not what Trump did after the 2020 election was democratic, because Vance is not great at dissembling in that particular way. Trump is more effective at it, and different parties across the world have different approaches to this question, but the point is that they need to be able to keep the mask on, right, in order to win, right? And I think that's true for the vast majority of their supporters, most of whom would say themselves that they're voting to uphold democracy, not destroy it.
There was a question there in the back, and then we will come. Yeah, there was two questions in the back. So first, sir, and
Stanley Cover. I'm struck by the similarity, excuse me, with the situation a couple of hundred years ago, when the Enlightenment gave way to the Romantic Rebellion. The Enlightenment being based on universal human principles, we know the Declaration of Independence, but especially after the French Revolution, you had the rise of nationalism, which emphasized the land. I'm looking at Fichte's addresses to the German nation, and he says, the original stock of the new culture, the Germans, bravely resisted the oncoming world dominion of the Romans. Sounds a lot like the anti-globalist sentiment today. And I'm wondering if maybe we should look to this historical example as a precedent for what we are now seeing.
Yeah, I actually have sort of incoherently thought about this parallel a lot, this idea of understanding modern anti-democratic politics as a romantic rebellion to the almost hyper-rationality of politics in the post-end of history era, and hyper-technocratic elements of those politics that in some ways resembles the Enlightenment way of thinking about politics in its purest, most distilled form. I don't have any reflections beyond said incoherent musings. That's to say, I haven't really thought it through in any way that I can give you a satisfying answer on the question. What I can say is it's a fascinating parallel, and any way to draw it out more seriously, we need to contend with the differing institutional environments. right? I think it is very significant that we're operating at a time when democracy isn't an upright or sort of an upstart system of government, but rather, the established and dominant, or at least most popular form of government globally. And that changes the way that a romantic rebellion might express itself. But I do think there's a lot there, and a lot particularly in the emotive appeals, the way the politician like Trump or Modi in particular have this incredible emotional resonance with their supporters. Right? I attended Modi's state visit at the White House last year, I guess that was earlier this year, and was struck by the intensity and the fervor of the Modi supporters who had showed up at the White House. The degree in which, when I talked to them, they described him as an avatar of their own hopes, fears, aspirations. One of them told me that Modi was bringing world peace, right? That's what would happen if he was in power, the more he was in power. This grandiose sense of purpose, right, that comes alongside their politics, right, their approach to politics. It's very powerful. And now that I think about it, as I'm talking out loud, there is a bit on this of the book at the very end, not used in those language, but it's more counterposed with Nietzsche and Nietzsche's vision of politics and how romantic or sort of emotive, strength-based ways of thinking about politics lead people analytically astray. Nietzsche, for instance, thought the strongest state in Europe at the time he was writing was Tsarist Russia. Turns out to have been a bit of a misestimation of where strength actually was set up in Europe at the time. But no, it's a fascinating set of parallels that I'd really like to explore more.
Great. So last two questions, the lady in the back, and then we come back there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Amelie Jacobke at Columbia, New York. I actually wanted to ask a question regarding what you just mentioned, the mask on, because I'm also working on comparative transnational illiberal tendencies around the world. And very interesting, obviously, to link it with the questions of emotional revolutionary ways to frame politics. But before also you mentioned mano dura, right? Like of Bukele in Latin America, you have that tendency of authoritarianism in many countries. Regarding your research, I wondered, and I would be very interested in what did you find regarding like common shared characteristics of the narratives, like the political narratives. How is authoritarianism framed nowadays in a way that, what did you see? What are the main takeaways? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think going back to our very first question, one of the overarching themes of anti-democratic politics internationally is illiberalism, right? Is describing their politics as being not against democracy, but standing up for democracy against authoritarian liberalism, right? I think that Sam's question about Tim Walz was very much to that point, right? People like Walz should know better than to speak so bluntly, not just because it's possibly bad policy, but also because it fits directly in the narrative that's being spun, right? The anti-democratic argument being we're defending democracy because, and Orban has done more to theorize this than anybody. I would really recommend, if you haven't, going and reading his speeches. God, my Magyar is not great, but Bajle Tuznad, I believe, is the name of the, someone who speaks Hungarian better than me can say, but is the name of the summer camp where he gives these speeches semi-regularly, right? And he's given a series of addresses trying to outline this theory, where he argues that the European Union represents a fundamentally totalitarian form of politics, right? And here you can see that he's drawing on the work of people that he's met, not just Reisgard Legutko, who obviously has some connections with him, but also Yoram Hazony in Israel, and Patrick Devine here in the United States. Both make sort of similar arguments, right? And Orban has met with all of them and is very smart guys, integrated their thought into his, and argues that this tendency of liberalism towards demanding conformity on liberal ideals, right, towards a liberal vision, to crushing multiculturalism, or the death camp of tolerance, as it was called in the South Park episode, that is what he's fighting against. He's standing up for the self-determination of the Hungarian people against liberalism's tendency to make everybody into fundamentally the same kind of person. That argument plays out in different ways, less theoretically sophisticated ways in different places. Right? Sometimes, I mean, even in Orban's own language, right? Sometimes it's just rank xenophobia, making a similar kind of argument, right? The liberals are forcing immigrants down their throats when he's being less grandiose. And you can see, obviously, versions of that in the MAGA movement. You can see it being expressed as anti-Arab or anti-Muslim prejudice in Israel and Hungary, but also, Israel and India, excuse me, but also in a variety of more sophisticated ways. So I would add, maybe to codify it more clearly, a combination of opposition to liberalism and a sense that there is a minority, a particular minority group defined along probably ethno-national lines or ethno-religious lines, that is itself a threat that needs to be dealt with. Right? Those two things, the conjunction of anti-liberalism and anti-minority politics, are at the heart of anti-democratic rhetoric.
Wonderful. And last question.
Yeah, David Baer, Texas Lutheran University. I have a question. I think in your presentation, you were answering your, I think it's when you were answering your puzzles, and you said something about the current illiberalism, I guess, is right wing because I thought you were saying it's a cultural phenomenon and not an economic phenomenon. You presented that as sort of a sort of closed question. Was that? So I wonder if you might. I mean, I think that if you look at Orban, economic populism has been a central element of his way of ruling, and I mean, certainly many people have suggested that Trumpism draws strength from whatever economic anxiety, insecurity of working class. So if you could just elaborate on that, because it doesn't seem like a closed question to me.
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate that. Also, I've read some of your pieces recently at the Bulwark. They've been good. So the reason I treated it like that is that this was a debate that starting around 2015, 2016, became one of these really intense flashpoints in public discourse. And I just spent an immense amount of time just like reading study after study, right? Looking at, trying to do their best to parse out the various different explanations. And every single time, right? I mean, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but not much, right? Overwhelmingly, the highest quality research that did the best job at causal identification would come to the conclusion that economic factors, however you try to codify them, be they income, be they self-identified class, be it employment status, right? When you can look at those effects and isolate them, they tend not to have a very strong predictive effect on vote share for far-right parties. This is especially true once you control for the effect of education rules. So it tends to be that the archetypal supporter for a far-right party in the United States or Europe is not somebody who's like a down-on-their-luck victim of globalization. It's somebody who makes relatively decent wages but doesn't have a college degree. Right? That's the hardest core of the base of those groups. And I mean, really, like I said a second ago, the only way to do this is to look at the studies individually. And if you want, we can go through citations, and look at the different comparisons and say this study was persuasive on this point. In this country, this study was persuasive on another one. There was one really good study in India, I'll cite this just to sort of in lieu of some of the other ones, that looked at an election in the early 90s, and specifically at the behavior of Brahmins, upper caste Indians, and it looked at poor Brahmins in an issue where caste and class were both significant, right? The Congress Party had been campaigning on a redistributive class platform, but also had been campaigning on a redistributive caste platform, where they were trying to expand benefits to lower caste groups, right? Basically, India has like the largest and oldest affirmative action program in the world. They wanted to build it out. And what they found is that despite there being significant material benefits to these Brahmin voters, these poor Brahmin voters who voted in Congress, when caste became more salient in this election, they voted overwhelmingly for the BJP, right? And the BJP became the upper caste party because they opposed the expansion of the affirmative action program, right? Because they stood for upper caste politics. And there's just example after example of this, right? It also partially explains why Trump is able to get away with talking like an economic populist, but not acting like one, right? His major legislative proposal and accomplishment was a tax cut, and there's been really very little in the way of really class politics and the way we formally understand them. And that's not to say, by the way, that economic factors have no effect on elections. So I want to be careful. I'm not saying that. There are some good studies on exposure to trade, for example, has increased Republican vote share in the United States. Of course, that's Republican vote share, not Trumpist vote share. It's not necessarily more specific than that. So the studies, you need to parse them very, very carefully. But those effects, the effect size, tends to be a lot smaller than when you can identify variables like hostile sexism or racism, which or education level, which suggests to me that non-material factors, again, and there's been just a ton of research, right? That's the last thing, right? These non-material factors are more important, and the volume of hundreds of studies, to me, the weight of them really militates in favor of that explanation being true. Although with the replication crisis, who the hell knows what's actually true?
Well, I think on that, it's a great way to conclude, just showing how much there are things to unpack and to be discussed. So, Zack, I wanted to thank you for this kind of great food for thought and opening of our discussion. Please join me in thanking Zack for